college career for any time you have to write a paper or do a presentation in class, and you'll find out why in a minute. So stories are really powerful, right? Who here is on either an email list or mailing list from nonprofits that want you to donate money to them? All right, great, almost in the majority here. So one question that researchers wanted to find out is, how can these nonprofits be as successful as possible in getting people to donate to their cause? And the cause they decided to examine as a test case was the issue of starvation in Africa. So they sent out 3 letters. One letter to one group, one letter to another, one group to the third. The first letter told about how broad the problem was. It said about the tens of millions of people facing starvation in Africa, the millions of people displaced by war and famine, and so on and so forth. The second letter ignored all those broad issues and just told the story of one young African child and what life was like for her on a day-to-day basis as a child facing starvation. And the third letter had both. It had the story about the young girl, and it had all the broader statistical information. So which one of these letters do you think ended up raising the most money for this charity? Who would say the first one, to talk about how broad the problem was? Who would say the second one, the one that had just the story? And who would say the third one, the one that had both the story and the stats? Right, so it turned out that when the letters went out, the donations came back, at the end of the day, it was the second letter that generated the most donations, and it generated about twice as many donations as either of the other two. And in fact, the letter that had both the story and the stats did only slightly better than the one that had only the stats, which tells us 2 things. Number one, stories are really powerful. So if you've ever seen those TV commercials, which I imagine most of us have, of someone in Africa and all these starving children pleading with you to donate, while it may pull our heartstrings and we may feel upset by it, those commercials work because they tell a story about individuals and they get people to care and get people to donate. Right? So stories are really important. And the second thing this tells us is that just the way we are hardwired biologically, statistics, broader information, they just don't really move us. Right? There's a quote that's often attributed to the Russian leader, Joseph Stalin, which he supposedly said, "The death of one man is a tragedy, the death of a million men is a statistic." And there's a lot of psychological truth to that. We are hardwired to care about individuals, individual people, individual animals, individual trees, individual whales. They're just individuals, or very small groups. We're not hardwired to care about large numbers, and statistics and thinking with that logical database portion of the brain, for whatever reason, tends to make us less compassionate. And here's why this is useful for you and your college careers. There's a really good study from a professor at Stanford who had his students, every student in his class had to give a presentation on the subject of his or her choice. So they got up, they gave the presentation, it was like a 5-minute talk, then they all sat down again at the end, and he put out, he spread surveys around the class to see what they remembered of one another's presentations. And what he found is that of the facts that had been given that day by students, only about 5% of those facts were remembered by the classmates. But of the stories that were given that day by students, about 65% of them, of those stories, were remembered by the classmates. In other words, facts, statistics, in one ear and out the other. Stories, they stick with us. We remember them, they have an emotional impact on us, it's easier for us to recall them, and they shape our life and our attitudes and our behaviors much more than stats and data ever will. All right, so